In this video, we'll look at the clothing during the most of the 20th century, from World War I to pretty much close we can get in the present. In World War I, the American soldier was dressed primarily in just like this drab outfit because it kind of gave them camouflage. Like the trenches, they were all issued a standard wide cap. Pants legs tended to go down to about the middle of the shin, and then you would wrap these leg wrappings of cloth around them that would give additional protection and support. A vestige of the old cavalry, you had wide width pants pulled up by riding boots and the officers. But the Americans were late into the war, and they'd learned many things from the Allies earlier. After World War I, during the 1920s, wealthy men still wanted to look good socializing in the evenings at such things as cocktail parties during Prohibition. But they still wanted to look a bit more relaxed than the tuxedos of their elders. This led to the popularity of dinner jackets, which no longer had the tails and, for the most stylish or rebellious, might even be white. Women's styles in the 1920s were really revolutionary. You get the so-called flapper look from among young women. The term flapper, they're not sure where it came from, but it may have come from an earlier term that kind of was a teenage girl. Their ponytails would flap against their back, or it may have come from an old English term for a prostitute. They're not sure, but it wasn't intended really to be complimentary. The flapper look, like I said, was real popular among the young women. Its skirts were up, and you had all sorts of makeup on. You had the corsets, of course, were gone. You have open-toed shoes and shorter hair, and just a lot of jewelry and ornamentation, things like a boa shown here. It kind of all represented a rebellious culture among young people against Victorian mores. While men weren't as adventuresome as women, who took more readily to plaids and new decorative designs in their clothing, increasingly men wore colors and designs, such as stripes. Men were more adventuresome in their ties. In the 1920s, white-collar men, and that term was kind of thought for an office worker, they always wore suits with loose-fitting pants, wider lapels, and many men still wore vests. Double-breasted suits were just starting to grow in popularity, but they really took off later in the 1930s and 1940s. So-called boater-style hats were real popular with men in the 1920s. Younger men might match their boater-style hats with sweaters in lieu of vest, and they often had on saddle shoes. The saddle shoes dated to the Victorian age, but the more lenient culture of the 1920s made them popular with both genders. In 1923, the Converse company made its all-star shoe, the signature shoe, they said, of the famed basketball player Chuck Taylor, sort of as Michael Jordan of his day. As part of that deal, Taylor had to tour the country selling his shoes. Now, of course, at the end of the 1920s came the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Everybody still, however, wanted to project style and success. They didn't want people knowing they were out of business or they're on hard times. Women would real often use shawls with the hats that weren't quite as elaborate as the Victorian age, but were more 1920s style. Men, you can still see here, young men also living it up during the Great Depression. By the 1930s and 1940s, men's suits increasingly had tapered trousers and tapered arms. The pants grew increasingly looser, and pleated pants, which was kind of originally a Western type of style, became the rage. Double-breasted suits remained popular. During the 1940s, men's ties began to get wider. The fedora style hat was very popular in the 1930s and 1940s. You'd see downtown street, all the men wearing hats like this. In World War II, you're going to see everything, of course, mass-produced and standardized, and the American Army uniform again reflected the camouflage thinking. The helmets had advanced, but when you went in the Army, they gave you everything. I mean, they gave you undershirts and underpants and socks, and people would say, that's government issue, and pretty soon the term GI for government issue became to refer to the soldier themselves. In World War II, there were restrictions on everything, obviously to conserve for the war effort. Things like metals and gasoline and rubber, but also fabric. And the government would tell clothing manufacturers how much fabric they could use. And among many young people, that kind of a result was a so-called zoot suit. It was a clothing that really showed used a lot of fabric. It was kind of a statement of rebellion. After World War II, all the soldiers came home and the American lifestyle changes, and we enter the prosperous 1950s and 1960s. This is the economic boom of the post-World War II era that really dramatically changed what Americans wore and how they acted. After the war, of course, all the soldiers came home, and there was a baby boom. People born between 1946 and 1964. Well, what you're going to see is this demographic sort of movement, this cohort's going to work its way through the United States history. When they're little, there's a demand for things that little babies use. And when they get older, there's demands for things that older kids use. And this process just continues as the baby boom ages. In the 1950s, you always had disposable diapers, which made things really easy. In 1950s, young kids would often join the Mickey Mouse Club. It was sort of a series by Walt Disney for kids watching the new television. And they marketed these mouse hats, and that became the rage among young kids. Television was, of course, becoming ubiquitous. And as the kids age, if you're a boy, you might start wearing a coonskin cap because that was what the television show character Davy Crockett wore. And here you can see a kid that's obviously a fan of that. By the end of the 1950s, some teenagers and young adults began to rebel. Now think about it. This is people with the early wave of the baby boom, right after into World War II. They're getting a little bit older, and young people rebel. And so that began to be reflected in their style of clothing and their behavior. They became sort of known as the Beatniks. Beatniks were kind of what we might say cool, they had the shades on and you wear a lot of sweaters and just try to break convention. In the movies in the 1950s, they emulated things like the biker look with the leather jackets, and of course leather jackets remain popular not only among the biking group but just as a style statement today. Certainly by the end of the 1950s, attitudes began to change. The first bikinis were marketed in the United States, although most women maintained a one-piece bathing suit in the 1950s and 1960s. Bikinis really exploded in popularity in about the mid-60s. The first modern wrinkle-free cotton shirts began to be developed in the 1950s, but they didn't really become widely available until later in the 1960s. For many Americans, this so-called permanent press, that's what we now refer to it, were a huge advance in clothing. When it came to styles, women preferred snug, tight waistlines, first popularized by the designer Christian Dior in the late 40s. There was a minority of women who liked dresses with no waistline, the so-called sack dresses, but that was definitely a minority. The hair was curled and short, although young girls did like ponytails. The dresses for women flowed, but they were starting to come up because the restrictions on nylon during the war had been lifted and women felt more comfortable showing their legs with nylon stockings, so the skirt lengths began to go up. You do see rather rigid pointed bras popular, and women in general tried to appear elegant. You see the popular designer Gabrielle Coco Chanel, although she was already in her 70s. When it came to men, they tried to look sophisticated. They generally wore suits, but the double-breasted jackets of the war years had ended. Those who wore jackets tended to like to have a waistline. You do see hats still popular with men, and if they're going to go casual, you see more color in plaids. In some instances, they would wear colorful, almost Hawaiian-themed short sleeve shirts that they'd leave untucked. Also, you begin to see a casual shirt with a wide collar over a sweater, and so the style was pretty common for the very common for the 1950s. The Hawaiian shirt itself was first marketed in the early 1960s by the Hawaiian Fashion Guild. They quickly became popular casual clothes to men, in large part because of the Elvis Presley 1961 movie Blue Hawaii. The American fashion industry took off in the post-war 50s and 1960s. Companies began licensing specific designers. They would strike a deal where they would produce clothes just for them to market. While older women would remain wearing nylons, younger women in the 1960s, again as the baby boom begins to age, begin to be more adventuresome, and you start seeing the miniskirt introduced in mid to late 1960s. Also in the 1960s, women would couple with their miniskirt high boots that would cover their entire shin. In the early 60s, many women curled their hair at the end, sort of the Jackie O. Kennedy look. But as time passed, many young women adopted a more long, straight style, usually parted in the middle. As time passed in the 1960s, younger men liked Indian-inspired what they called Nehru jackets, made popular by entertainers such as Johnny Carson and musicians such as the Beatles. By the late 60s, you're seeing some of that rebellious attire as the baby boom ages, and you're starting to see really popularity of sandals with both young men and young women. During the 1960s, University of Oregon track coach Bill Bowerman started a shoe company with one of his former runners, a guy named Phil Knight. The company's name was Blue Ribbon Sports, but by the 1970s, it had gone with a new brand, Nike. The company paid a student $35 to design a logo, in which he designed was a V-shaped swoosh. One morning while eating breakfast at home, Bowerman decided to pour rubber into his waffle iron, and the result was the beginning of the waffle shoe, which is so standard in many tennis shoes today. Probably one of the biggest, most notable changes in how people attire themselves as the 1960s passed was hair length for men. You kind of see this led by the celebrities, the Beatles, the famous rock group, of course. They were known as the mop tops. But as the 60s passed and people adopted longer and longer hair as a sign of rebellion, you're really seeing by the late 60s really long hair. This is the heyday of popularity of long hair. The rebellious young people, the baby boomers, as they get older by the late 60s, you kind of adopt anything goes style. And as I say, it tended to shock. People referred to them as hippies. You had the whole entire hippie attire, bell bottoms, tie-dyed became popular. It's sort of exotic clothing of all types. They were all symbols of a changing attitude in late 60s. And people, you know it as the counterculture. By you get into the 1970s, obviously the door of so many norms have been broken open. The styles were not surprisingly eclectic and dynamic. They also varied among different subgroups. If you're talking the early 1970s, young women sported still a lot of the hippie look, peasant blouses. You still saw the hot pants and mini skirts and the high boots and so forth. And a lot of fringes and tassels were popular with this set. Bell-bottom pants were popular among both genders, and as the decade progressed, women wore platform shoes and wide-brimmed hats. Cosmetics and makeup were a big change from the 1960s because they became popular again. Some adopted a more androgynous look by the late 1970s, and you can see this in some of the glam rock stars of the day and age, like the rock star David Bowie, most notably Sinner, and you can see it also in like Keith Partridge from the Partridge Family, and shown on the bottom. Throughout the 1970s, denim was really popular among both genders, and it was often styled and ornamented with such things as rhinestones and designs and things sewn into it. T-shirts were much more common for both genders, and you begin to see them mass-produced with designs and advertisements or messages, which hadn't been as the case in the previous decades. As the number of women increased in the business and professional world, they wore pantsuits, and you can see some of the common pantsuits here. In the early 1970s, women still wore their hair straight and long like they did the previous decade, but as the decade progressed, a new shag or feathered look became popular, which was made popular by the actress Farrah Fawcett, who's woman in the middle here, you can see her. That hairstyle was very popular. You do see African American haircuts, the afro, popular, and also perms are popular. By the end of the decade, some women sported shorter hair, but it was still frequently styled with curls and wings type of styles. While many men just kept it simple with the t-shirt and jeans and tennis shoes, by the late 1970s, many men preferred polyester suits with wide lapels and bright colors. They would tuck them in their shirts, but unbutton them halfway down the chest, and they would wear gold necklaces or medallions, and they would try to show their chest hair. It was all part of the disco image. For casual wear, many men embraced the so-called leisure suits, and they always had wide lapels, and they sometimes came with vest. When men wore shorts, they often wore them short and tight, and they'd have high athletic socks. Men's hairstyles varied widely throughout the decade. Sideburns and facial hair were popular in the decade, but they began to fade as the decade passed. I'd mentioned polyester earlier. That had been first developed in the 1940s. It was known as Dacron, and it became popular with the disco look. And after the 1970s, polyester is it's everywhere. Men's ties had gotten wider during the 1930s and part of the 1940s, and in the 50s, men's ties kind of narrowed. Well, in the 60s, you're going to begin to see them growing a bit wider, and that's certainly a well evident in the 1970 styles. Another popular mass-produced look that became popular in the late 70s was the baseball cap. Now, Major League Baseball, they'd had caps for a while, and it changed. In the 1950s, they introduced a new style, and that's a style that kind of stuck. And in the 70s, people began to wear these baseball caps outside of the ballpark, and they'd often be emboldened with something, a statement, kind of a fashion statement or a political statement or something. And by the 1990s, of course, some people began wearing them backward as a fashion statement. By the 1980s, the globalization had begun to really consolidate the whole fashion industry. And the fashion industry had become, majorly publicly traded companies. I mean, it's gotten a huge, huge business. The biggest stories were these designers and everything, and investors sort of moving into Wall Street and buying and selling, and the retail industries continued to merge, so you get more and more department store companies making deals with these investors, sort of to market a certain style in retail. By the 1980s, in women's styles, blouses were off the shoulder. That was something new. You see shoulder pads really popular in women like Lady Diana shown here, but they were high-waisted jumpsuits, and a lot of young women wore tight leggings on their legs, often with thick, pulled-up knee socks over them. Every generation's we're looking to be rebellious when you're young, and in the 1980s, many younger women adopted an even more adventuresome look than styles of earlier generations. You see it's all reflected in singers like Madonna on the left and Cyndi Lauper on the right. They were popular in the 80s. The style included, teased and dyed hair, excessive ornamentation, bracelets and hooped earrings out the wazoo, and they just try to match odd colors, and just had a ton of makeup. Denim had been popular in the 60s and 70s, and denims remains popular in the 80s, and like the 1970s, you're seeing a lot of ornamentation in your denim. Unlike the 1970s, you're starting to see the popularity of acid wash denim. I had mentioned leather jackets have been popular among the cool set. Well, in the 80s, they become mass marketed, often with Ray-Ban aviator glasses, which had sort of been made popular by Tom Cruise in the movie Top Gun. You can see that's a picture from that on the bottom right. Given the broad social trends of the 1980s, men's business suits were largely conservative. The many young people had adopted a preppy style that it was real popular. You had bright color polo shirts, khakis, boat shoes, sweaters worn around their shoulders, just in bright button-down shirts. By the late 80s, it became popular among men to wear like t-shirts with designer jackets over them, and they'd kind of pull the sleeves up. This was a look that was made popular by the popular TV show Miami Vice. And you can see the actor Don Johnson here. It wasn't popular to carry a pistol like that. That's because this picture is taken from the TV series. But an example of some of the designer jackets was the members only jacket were popular with men. Hip hop style began to grow from the African American community and soon became popular with young people from all races. You can see this, I might note, in the evolution of basketball style. In the 70s, you had these short pants up in the top right were popular, tight short pants, like I said. But when you get into the 90s and beyond, if today, you have a lot of longer, looser basketball pants, and that sort of came from the emerging hip-hop culture. Athletic shoes remained popular, and Nike company had a huge success in 1985 when it released its Air Jordan basketball shoes. High-priced basketball shoes. It was named for the famous University of North Carolina and Chicago Bulls star Michael Jordan, shown here on the bottom right. Still a lot of young people in the 80s, and of course young people are rebellious. As styles went back conservative, you do see a return to sort of a rebellious feeling. They're going to rebel against the mass marketing, and this type of rebellious style among some men and women was the grunge style, and it sort of grew out of Seattle and was led by bands like Nirvana. You can see it in the Kurt Cobain on the bottom right. It was again a subculture rejecting mass marketing, fashion, and music. It was it was made up of like a mishmash of durable thrift store type of clothing, usually loose fitting and sometimes worn as a sort of a remnant of the 70s, the androgynous manner. Now, when you start getting into the 1990s, clothing and hairstyles remained eclectic and varied. That's really not surprising because the mass marketing and mass production, it's taken off so much. The companies are going for smaller and smaller niche customers. But in general, you can speak of some broader trends, and one of them was towards a more relaxed business attire. Increasingly large companies instituted what they called casual Fridays, allowing their employees to dress really casually. This trend was increased by the growth of the technology sector, and you think of all those large companies in California and Silicon Valley that got started during the 90s, and then it spread to pretty much middle America. Of course, with the economy growing and the market increasing and increasing sort of advertising towards niche audiences, by the time you get into the 2000s, the fashion industry is really just global and is a conglomerate, and there's a real market for niche luxury styles, and you often see in the fashion industry things that always been artistic, but it's increasingly seems to me artificial. And for example, you'd have laser cut computers and automatically replenishing store data system alerts, and it's the designers would come out with a seasonal model, and it's then marketed as it's all coordinated. And magazine editors and stylists had gone on to become designers, and Hollywood actors and pop stars kind of started their own, individual designer brand. And when you get to the outset of the 21st century, what defines the fashion industry really didn't have much more to do with the artisan's craft, which you kind of think of it when it began much earlier. But it really just sort of just a huge, big multinational business. With all this marketing, these companies are quick to pick up on these trends, and so you still see these clothing fads that were then quickly marketed and became big businesses. For example, in the 70s, you had the beach look with sort of the flip-flops, and that became the rage among young people. Certainly when I was growing up, everybody had flip-flops. And you begin to see in the mid-2000s, just another example of this is Croc shoes. I've always struck me as a kind of a weird looking shoe, but it's, I guess, comfortable with plastic foam and kind of like resembles a sandal. A real style in recent years among young people has been not just young people, but tattoos. Tattoos, of course, had always been around since Native American times, but in the 2000s, you're really seeing them become more expressions of artistry, and tattoo shops grew up everywhere. It undoubtedly was a sort of a rebellious thing early, and it's now becoming pretty much commonplace. In rural and southern parts of the country, especially, but everywhere. Remember, you see the style of camouflage hunting gear, and that's often coupled where you get camouflage on all sorts of normal attire. If you get to today, of course, one look around, the men's hairstyles and everything. It's so collected, anything goes. In men's hairstyles, baldness is considered, if not acceptable for many men, almost something that it looks like it's stylish, and men begin to shave their male pattern baldness, if not their full head of hair. Goatees are common today, and so is the popularity of very short facial hair, like 2 or 3 day growth. Obviously, today the fashion industry is going to reflect the economy, and the economy is affected by e-commerce, and it's transforming every bit of our aspect of our lives. And who knows what's going to happen in the future electronically? The growth of the e-commerce business is undoubtedly going to continue to transform American clothing industry, just like it has in the past. To technological advances, and the marketing and mass production is going to continue, and so who knows what clothing's future has. But in any event, this concludes the last of the videos on the history of American clothing.